Good evening. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. My name is Ronald Simpson-Bey. I am the Director of Outreach and Alumni Engagement for Just Leadership USA. We are a national criminal justice reform organization committed to educating, elevating, and empowering the people and communities most impacted by the criminal legal system and systemic racism to drive, amplify, and sustain the kinds of policy reform that builds thriving, sustainable, and healthy communities, as well as a fair and equitable society. I'm honored to present today our panel, which the title of which is The Role of Directly Impacted Communities in Shaping the Future of Criminal Justice. This nationally recognized panel of presenters is composed of experts with a range of lived and educational experience in efforts to transform the American criminal legal system. Their joint professional experience includes grassroots organizing, direct services, training and technical assistance, and full-time employment and consultation with the federal government. The past three administrations have tried to address the contradictions in America's legal systems, yet change has been minimal and currently is being rolled back bit by bit. So this panel will seek to explain why directly affected people should have positions of influence in shaping the future of criminal justice in America. At this time, I would like to share a poll question with the audience. If you would click on polls, we'll see the first question. Would you click on it, please? Can you guys see the poll? Let me roll this event to proceed this thing. Oh, it's not allowing me to publish it. Guess I have to skip it. Do you see it, Vivian?
I
No,
see
I
it.
think you may have to participate yourself in order for you to see it. Yeah, I see it.
All right.
All right.
Okay, we'll continue on.
I see
So
one vote showing so far.
I see
A
two.
couple of votes.
Yeah, people can see it. If you click on polls, you can see it. I can see it.
I did, but it's not allowing me to vote. So I'm going to go ahead
Oh,
with the presentation.
okay.
At this time, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists. And our first panelist presenter, her name is Dr. Vivian Nixon. She is the Executive Director of Community and College Fellowship, which works to increase women's access to higher education. CCF's constituents, primarily women of color, have all had their lives affected by policing, prosecutions, and correction systems. In the late 1990s, Vivian served 3 years incarcerated at Albion State Correctional Facility in New York. It was the single most cathartic experience in her life. In prison, she became an educator, a mentor to women of all ages. Vivian is a high-profile advocate in the criminal justice reform movement, as well as a prolific writer. She co-wrote the book, What We Know, Solutions from Our Experience in the Justice System. She also serves as the chairperson on the board of directors for Just Leadership USA. Our second presenter is Saad Solomon. He is the founding executive director of Peace by Peace Incorporated, serving Delaware, which provides comprehensive social services, workforce development, vocational training, and supportive transitional housing to returning citizens. He is a subject matter expert in the specialization of reentry evidence-based practices and workforce development. Mr. Solomon became the first directly impacted person hired by the United States Attorney's Office in the District of Delaware, where he served as a senior reentry specialist for the United States Probation Office in the District of Delaware. He is a graduate of Just Leadership's Leading with Conviction 2019 Fellowship Program. And our last presenter is Guy Hamilton Smith. Guy is a fellow with the Sex Offense Litigation and Policy Resource Center at the Mitchell Hamline School of Law. He is a 2019 Just Leadership Fellow and a member of the Law and Society Association's Division on Punishment and Society. His work has focused on the relationship between accountability and punishment, felony disenfranchisement, and how policies intended to prevent sexual harm, such as post-convictional sex offense registries and civil commitment, undermine not just those prevention efforts, but core criminological and constitutional principles as well. Well, enough of me talking. I would like for our panelists to introduce themselves and take about 10 minutes to talk about their work, how the work that they do shapes the impact in the future of criminal justice, and why effective people need to have positions of influence in shaping the criminal justice reform conversation. Vivian, would you take time to share your thoughts with us?
I would be happy to. Thank you so much, Ronald, for that introduction. And thank you to the American Bar Association for including this really important topic in this conference. I discovered while I was incarcerated for 3 years that our prison system is used for purposes far beyond public safety, which I believe is the reason most of our citizens who are paying taxes and contributing to this multi-billion-dollar industry believe they are contributing to public safety. The reason I know that public safety is not the primary outcome of the criminal justice system is that the majority of the people I met in prison were not threats to public safety. They were, more likely than not, victims of failed social systems who had made some mistakes, who may have made poor choices, but who also had been harmed early on in their lives, who had had very little access to opportunity, who were undereducated and harmed. And I began to ask myself, is there another way we could have intervened as a society in order to prevent harm, not only to the women I was incarcerated with, but any harm they may have caused to anyone else in their community or in their family? For me, the answer to that question began with education. Like anything else, education is no silver bullet, but it is a primary means whereby we transform ourselves to view ourselves and our roles in society differently and begin to use critical thinking skills to interact with people differently, to make different decisions, and to create a path for ourselves that gives us a role in society that builds upon our strengths instead of preying upon our weaknesses. College and Community Fellowship is the organization that I joined when I was released from prison. I was looking for an organization that would help me accomplish all those goals that I just mentioned. It is not easy to find a program that focuses on those goals in our society, and it definitely wasn't easy in 2001 when I was released from prison, because most of the programs were focused on the basics. Do you have a place to live, and do you have a job? And unfortunately, when they asked those questions, they meant, do you have any place to live? Do you have any job? So the quality of that place to live did not matter. The quality of that job did not matter. The propositions for you to have a future didn't matter. And I really wanted those things to matter. Well, at College and Community Fellowship, we found what we call a formula. that we put together. What is it that makes people's lives work so that they can accomplish all these things without being marginalized to having the basic minimums and nothing else in life? After all, who comes into this world and aspires to only have the basic minimum? We all aspire to do the very best we can do in life. So with that, let me tell you a little bit about how we do our work. Now I'm going to try to start sharing, and if it doesn't work, let me know, because I am no genius when it comes to technology. Let me know if I'm sharing. Am I?
No, we don't see your screen.
I'm not
Okay.
seeing a share.
I don't think
Okay. All right. So we will. Oh, I do have to do something here. There we go. I think I might have figured it out.
start sharing.
Yep. Yeah, the start script sharing button on the bottom of my screen in the platform won't let me share. So we'll do it without sharing. That's okay. But I will be reading from my slides.
Okay.
So the mission of the organization is to help women whose lives have been affected by the criminal legal system earn college degrees so they, their families, and their communities can thrive. We also advocate for equity and opportunity for the communities we serve. We have a firm belief that the power of higher education is transformative, and that was not highly recognized in the reentry field for the people returning to the community until recently. The idea that all we deserve is the minimum is not enough. We do our work in 3 buckets. We do direct services, we do policy and advocacy, and we do technical assistance. Under direct services, we have community sisters, which is for those who are just entering into education and really need mentorship. We have academic support program, which we walk people all the way from applying to college until they graduate. We have our multi-gen program. Those women who have children, we teach them to incorporate their children into their educational journey because it makes it more likely then that their children will then also go on to college. We have peer mentoring, and then finally our career advancement program, because if you spend time getting a college degree, you want to have a position that is associated with your degree and that pays you what you're worth. In our policy work, we advocate for all policies that increase access to education, especially for those communities impacted by incarceration, which tend to be Black, Indigenous communities, Indigenous communities, and communities of color. We advocate for all policies that increase access, including returning Pell Grant eligibility to incarcerated students. We also do training. We train women to advocate for policies in their local communities. So if there's a city policy you want to change, we teach you how to speak to city council. If it's a state policy, go to your state assembly. If it's a federal policy, we will take people to Capitol Hill. And we do civic engagement work. That is being involved in the electoral process, understanding what these candidates stand for, and understanding your rights to vote in the state that you live and the importance of your vote. With your technical assistance, we will provide information to any nonprofit who wants to learn how to use the basic principles that we use in order to empower women to be part of the citizenry of this country and not just kind of this stigmatized community with a criminal record that society doesn't value, because we know that people have a lot to offer and that having a criminal conviction does not erase the good qualities that you have to bring to our society. See, I'll skip that slide. We did a study a few years ago that told us that social capital is built in the educational process. And social capital is that thing that people who are already born into the third or fourth generation of their family that's been to college, or the third or fourth generation that's owned a home, the third or fourth generation that's run their own business, tend to do the same thing. That it's you build capital around you, and the people around you are able to support you, to give you advice, to mentor you, to I think I heard somebody say at one point, oh, well, if you can't find a job, just ask your parents for a loan and start a business. Well, yeah, that's because those are people who are born into families that have social capital. Well, we teach the women that we work with how to build their own social capital, and we found that the best social capital that they had was themselves. They would learn about systems and opportunities and share it with each other and realize, wow, we really do have something to offer. We don't always have to be dependent on others. We are bringing something to the table, not just coming to the table asking for things. We learned that the women we worked with have big dreams for themselves and their children, and that they are able to accomplish those dreams with the right supports, and that in general, communities want to help people who have that potential. But we also learned something that's very much a part of the conversations we're having in our society today. We learned that the women we serve are in need of our services and in need of our community because they have been impacted by more than their prison experience, by more than their time in prison, their crime, or their own failures. They've been impacted by the failures of this nation to live up to its promise to be a government for the people, of the people, and by the people. They have not lived up to its promise to treat all people as equals. And we are seeing that play out in our society today. And so as we move forward, that is at the top of our agenda, to create a more equitable society so that we have equitable access to capital and finances, so that we are treated equitably in the workplace, that our children have equal schooling in our communities, and so that it no longer means to be a second-class citizen in America if your skin is black or brown.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Vivian. Thank you. We're going to have some questions for you, so don't go away. At this time, I'd like to call Saad Solomon. Saad, would you introduce yourself to the audience and talk a bit about your work and why you think, in your opinion, why directly affected people should have positions of influence in shaping the future of criminal justice in America?
Absolutely, Ronald. Thank you. First and foremost, I'd like to, as Vivian said, really thank the American Bar Association for including this panel in this conference. Such a meaningful space with so many meaningful legislative, future legislative, prosecutorial, defense, civil minds that will be contributing to understanding why it's such a critical space to have people that have been directly impacted by the criminal legal system to be a part of the future of molding the criminal legal system. If we're going to see change, we have to do something different. I actually began working for the United States Department of Justice, the United States Attorney's Office in the District of Delaware, by the most unconventional of routes. I was adjudicated guilty of my first felony at 11 years old. I would spend 6 years in and out of juvenile detention centers and juvenile custody and adjudicated of 46 thereafter felonies. And at 17 years old, I was convicted as an adult, non-amenable in family court, and sentenced to a 15-year adult punitive sentence. And during that sentence, I was raised by lifers. I was raised by men that were incarcerated for life sentences and they saw something in me, in my leadership, in my ability, in my personality, in something in my traits, and they breathed their life into me, such that I began living vicariously through them, through their eyes, and began to really internalize my own journey and understand what decision-making, choices, consequences. And uniquely, I believed myself to be fully cognizant of what was taking place both from the officer side and the administrative side, as well as the inmate prisoner side, and tried to really begin analyzing what was happening in my life around that for my very important formative years, again, 17 through 32. I emerged in 2010, working minimum wage jobs, as Vivian noted. You know, your probation and parole systems just want to see you working because there's a methodology, there's a body of data that says X amount of engagement hours in a certain period of time based on assessment meta-analysis says that you're more likely to be successful if you're deemed a certain risk level. Well, what we're doing in that system is creating standardized conditions that are akin to mandatory minimums. So as our judges and our judiciary are trying to direct the judiciary away from mandatory minimums, which reduces a judge's ability to have discretion on any given sentence, be it punitive and or rehabilitative, we're now moving more towards a direction in the opposite slant, but the same space. And that is contextually and figuratively and literally boxing people into and utilizing conditions that aren't representative of the population that overwhelmingly is being adjudicated under these conditions. So after working in the U.S. Attorney's Office and really addressing my own implicit bias towards U.S. attorneys and the system, I moved into working at the United States Probation Office, under which, if everyone understands, the Department of Justice is in the executive branch of government, and the judiciary holds the United States Probation Office. And so U.S. probation offices, 94 federal districts, are all beholden to the court because the administrative office of the court is where the funding and the support and the branching of that supervision, that supervised release takes place. Working with the U.S. Probation Office, I had an opportunity to work under brilliant U.S. District Court judges and brilliant U.S. Magistrate Court judges in the District of Delaware. Chiefly was Judge Gregory M. Sleet, who influenced my growth, my leadership, and mentored me in such a way that he himself was mentored with what Vivian described in eloquent form as social capital. You see, Judge Gregory Sleet's father, the Pulitzer Prize winning Moneta Sleet, was the personal photographer of Dr. Martin Luther King. And so going into Judge Sleet's chambers that fateful day when, as Chief District Judge, it was charged his responsibility to determine whether I would be a sworn officer of the court, it became a very poignant moment when social capital was transferred. And I began to understand a greater lens of what was taking place in the pivotal shift. I would go on to taking the U.S. Probation Office in Delaware, in the District of Delaware, from 47th in the nation of the 94 federal districts to a nation-leading 4th. That was studied by Harvard and is published online, validated, and really speaks to the impact of having someone that was directly impacted by the system working with not only the system, but bridging the gap with our returning formerly incarcerated people, because the exact moment that they are released, the moment that we come home, we're no longer returning. We have returned. And that's an ideology that began being adopted by the federal court system in 2003, by and large, when the first reentry courts, problem-solving courts, started to emerge. By now, we have about roughly 3/4 of the U.S. federal districts that have some sort of problem-solving court, be it mental health court, drug court, reentry court, veterans court, some unique iteration or iterative specification that takes away the standardized conditions and provides a specific space for men and women to have individualized, humanized supervision opportunities. The correlation between having that directly impacted policy and individuals returning back to incarceration has been described by so many academics, including Chris Lowenkamp and Dr. Ed Latessa, and the University of Cincinnati folks that designed the assessment tools of the federal system after doing meta-analysis. The correlation is so high that it is recommended that an individual's standardized conditions be reviewed prior to release. That's not taking place at this point. The Federal Bureau of Prisons is trying, but is falling behind in that process, because not only is it playing catch up, but the rate of current incarcerations is outpacing the capacity to meet demand. And that demand impacts individual lives that are predominantly brown and black, individual communities that are predominantly brown and black, inner city, urban, and impoverished, based on systemic, targeted policies that are so archaic that during Reconstruction, these policies are rooted. And the fiscal impact is over $98 billion in industry annually. So if you ask, is it deliberate? It is absolutely profitable, and profit capital drives absolute deliberate behavior. We know. Social anthropologists, social scientists understood that in the 50s. It's just now coming to the fore that our contributions are capable and valuable in addition to necessary. Why? Because when you live in the plausibility of believing in the possible, you do not have to relegate yourself to the probable, which is the statistical likelihood, which is what we know. But when you live in the possible, would you consider that education, the greatest equalizer in our society, arguably, can take an individual, man or woman, from deficit to asset? Is the investment worth it, you ask? It is. And it's demonstrated in every community that is building the social capital that Dr. Nixon has spoken about. And she'll always be a doctor to me. So I'll pass the mic back to Ronald and let my esteemed colleagues continue.
Thank you, Saab, for sharing such an amazing story and putting it in perspective for us. It's much appreciated. And I would like to remind our audience, if you have any questions while our panelists are talking, feel free to type them into the chat box. We will respond as we're going forward, and we hope to have a question and answer session after our last presenter presents here. Guy, would you mind introducing yourself and taking about 10 minutes to talk about the work you do and why it's important for directly impacted people to have a seat at the table creating policy around criminal justice reform?
Absolutely. Ronald, thank you. And I just really, I just want to express that it's quite an honor to share this space with my esteemed panelists. And also thank you to the American Bar Association, as Dr. Nixon and Saad both mentioned. This is a really important topic to give space to, and I'm just really appreciative that the ABA is doing that. And yeah, so to start with the work that I do, I'll just say that in law school, my favorite class was litigation skills, which is the class where I'm sure everyone knows is where they teach you how to do the stuff like cross-examination, opening and closing arguments. I went to law school because I wanted to work in criminal defense. And despite that, my professor for lit skills was a federal prosecutor. And of course, despite the fact that the roles that we occupied, or at least the role that I sought to occupy, that we were adversarial, we got along great. We had a great relationship. We talked all the time after class. And one day after class, the topic of sex offenders came up, and we were talking about that. And one thing he said to me is, he said, "Well, you know what we ought to do with sex offenders? We ought to take them all out, and we ought to line them up against a wall, and we ought to shoot them." And he didn't know it at the time, but he was talking about me. I have a very interesting journey in terms of how it was that I went through the legal system as a very young man, and that was how I got the idea actually to apply to law school. But the work that I do now, focusing on post-conviction sex offense registries and indefinite civil detention of people with past sex offense convictions, was not the work that I went to law school to do. I went to law school just because I wanted to do criminal defense work. And that was, it wound up being, that was the work that I did for several years until pivoting to the work that I do now. And the work that I do now, focusing on registries and civil commitment, it impacts the criminal legal system because it's essentially you might call it a shadow legal system that impacts almost 1 million people, has disparate impacts on communities of color and also LGBTQ populations. And you can kind of think, for people who aren't as, sort of intimately familiar with registries, most people aren't, but you can kind of think of them like probation or parole, except with even fewer constitutional protections. And when someone has a technical violation on probation or parole, they will, typically there will be some kind of graduated sanction. They won't necessarily be going back to prison. But in this context, when there is a technical violation, that's often a new felony offense. Which requires a new indictment, go through the criminal legal system again, go back to prison, enhanced sentencing, all that. And it's an enormous population of people. And I think that, the ideas that we have with these laws, what we want the law to do, ideally, is to, one, prevent harm from happening in the first instance, but then also for people who have caused harm to be held accountable for that. And I think that those are both pretty uncontroversial statements, but perhaps the more controversial statement is that I don't think, based on my own personal experiences and also the work that I do now, our laws don't do a very good job at either one of those things, and in fact undermine those goals that we want the law to bring about. And, and I come to this work that I do as not only someone, I'm directly impacted in multiple ways, both as a survivor myself and also someone who's caused harm. And the work that I do now, tries to bring to the table various stakeholders, including other survivors and survivor advocates who are working together to, try to effectuate those goals that I talked about, to hold people accountable in the first place. And then also to prevent harm from happening. But given the enormous population of people that we're talking about, and how oftentimes in criminal justice circles, these populations of people will be sort of fenced out, and you'll also see that in laws that get passed that seek to reform the criminal system, but will exclude people, for instance, convicted of violent offenses or convicted of offenses related to sexual harm. And if we want to, get to another place when it comes to mass incarceration and mass surveillance and mass control, then we're going to have to, as the work of Professor John Pfaff indicates, we're going to have to consider people who are convicted of violent offenses too. We're going to have to consider people convicted of sexual offenses. And so, and that is, how I see, or at least one of the ways I see in which the work that I do, the work that I focus on now, impacts the mission of criminal justice and criminal justice reform. And as to why I think it's important for directly impacted people to have a seat at the table and to be involved in this mission, I'll go back to my class, litigation skills. My professor said we ought to take sex offenders and we ought to shoot them. I didn't tell him that night because I wasn't entirely sure if he was armed. But I did at one point. He did tell him my story about how it was that I came to law school, and it was that connection that we had, and that he knew me, that was what changed his mind on a lot of things. In fact, and I've had plenty of experiences with people where I can talk about, statistics, or I can talk about, the social science research and like what's proven to be effective and what's not. And like those things are important, don't get me wrong. But in my experience, it's not what moves people. What moves people is like a personal connection and like having that perspective of someone who has gone through the criminal legal system, because they, as JLUSA's founder, Glenn Martin, who said, the people who are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. They're furthest from power and resources. And that's certainly been true in my experience, because if you want to know what works and what doesn't work, what's helped me to be accountable and to change and to grow as a human being, you can ask me and I'll be happy to tell you. And I'll also be happy to tell you that it's the ideas that that legislatures have in terms of what's going to help bring those things about, they often don't help, and they often compound the problem and make it worse. And so that's why I think that it's important to have people who are directly impacted in these positions, because you realize that they're not really any different from anyone else. And in fact, a lot of the times it's, it can oftentimes just be, who's the federal criminal defense attorney who wrote the book 3 Felonies a Day? Harvey Silvergate, I think is his name. But the general idea is that is just that the difference between people who've been convicted of crimes and people who have not been convicted of crimes is oftentimes not a lot, if at all. And so I think that that's why having these people who are directly impacted, it can help bring about and help foster change. That people who are policymakers or people who are in those positions of power can begin to see them, see people who are directly impacted as allies in this work, that we all want the same things. It isn't that people who are directly impacted don't live in the same communities that everyone else lives in, that we all want the same things. We all want safety. We all want people who've caused harm to be accountable for that and to change. And we can provide a unique perspective, and I would argue a needed perspective, on how we can go about doing that. So I think that's my bet. And I really appreciate being here. And thank you so much.
Thanks for sharing that, Guy. I was listening to you talking about being directly impacted, and it occurred to me that the difference from being having a felony conviction is a glass of wine and a traffic stop. So people need to be mindful of that. We have a question in the chat box for the panelists. Amy asks, what are some of the common missteps attorneys, and specifically trial attorneys, make when trying to work collaboratively with directly impacted communities? What are you guys' thoughts on that?
So I can address that. some of the common mistakes that trial attorneys make in collaboration is misidentifying partners. Quite literally, the same network of partners is utilized most often repetitively because attorneys are so reliant upon past proven reliable, credible sources. The court will not admit testimony or even recommendation from non-presented parties. And so trial attorneys frequently use the exact same or relatively similar partners. That collaboration limits the scope of benefit that could be extracted from widening that catchment. And that's where we, I think, can do better.
Vivian, Guy, you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. In the work that I did before, before the job that I have now, I worked in criminal defense work, and I also did, death penalty mitigation work. And in that context, it wasn't really so much about, movement building or a specific legislative or policy goal, but it was about, obviously trying to get the best result for this client possible. And I think, and perhaps it was owed to my own perspective of having gone through the system, I could have a certain level of empathy with our clients. And the thing that I saw that a lot of attorneys didn't know, I don't think really knew how to do well. A lot of trial attorneys knew how to do well. The good trial attorneys knew how to do this well, but was to just basically tell the person's story as if they're a human being, not as if they are, that there are more than this thing, this offense that brought them to this point in their lives. And so, I think that all trial attorneys, and I think it can get, it can kind of get easy especially if you work in a high volume, if you work in a high volume position like the public defender's office, to get burnt out and to stop seeing people as human beings, but to really put in that effort to see people not only as individuals and as human beings, but to try to figure out, in whatever that context is, in state court, federal court, even if it's a motion to dismiss, even you might not think that storytelling in that context would really necessarily matter, but I think that it does. And so I think that having that perspective as, seeing this person as a human being and figuring out how to tell their story in a way that's going to be most effective to, to the decision maker, whatever context that takes place in, is just, I don't know, it's a talent that I think a lot of, again, I think skilled trial attorneys have this because I think it's a necessary, it's just a necessary skill that you have to acquire. But again, I've also seen a lot of, terrible trial attorneys that don't seem to really, grasp that basic component or that basic, just that seed of an idea. So I think that's that's been the biggest thing that stuck out to me. Yeah.
Thank you, Guy.
Yeah, Liv? For me, it's about skill, but it's also about understanding that your responsibility to your client is the same whether you are working with someone who's paying you $500 an hour or whether you've been assigned a pro bono client. And I distinctly remember in my case, in my first case where I got probation, I got probation because my mother just happened to be able to access capital to pay for a professional pretrial report, right? A lot of times, attorneys who are assigned indigent clients don't look beyond, their own resources to try to find other people who might work with them to provide these extra supports to paint a real picture of who this person is for the court. And they only go by what they have on that sheet of paper. They usually don't have time to really engage with their clients. They don't have the extra money to get expert witnesses and expert testimony, pre-trial report from mental health professionals or addiction counselors. I think one of the things they can do is look outside their public defender office for other partners who are willing to work with them to paint a true picture of who their clients are.
Absolutely, absolutely. And while we're talking, if anybody in the audience have any other questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. I would like to chime in on this question, Amy, as well, about, what are some of the common missteps? We know Brian Stevenson in his book, Just Mercy, said that we are not the worst mistake or choice we ever made in our lives. And that we are people first. People that have been convicted of crimes. Myself, I spent 27 years on a wrongful conviction in the Michigan Department of Corrections from 1985 to 2012. I wrote the habeas petition that got my conviction overturned and led to my subsequent release. And while I was in prison, I was a well-known paralegal, and I used to do a lot of appellate work. And I had a situation one time where I wrote an issue for a gentleman who had a first-degree murder case. He was convicted of robbing $1.3 million from a Brinks truck. It was a huge, high public profile case in Michigan. And so I read the appellate brief that his attorney had written, and I read the record, and I saw the attorney had missed a major issue. And so I briefed the issue and had him send it to the attorney, asked him to supplement his appellate brief. The attorney sent a salty letter back, said, jailhouse lawyer can't tell me how to do my job. That issue has no merit. So I filed a supplemental brief myself on his behalf. And 8 months later, the Michigan Appellate Court overturned his conviction on the issue that I wrote and said that the other issues had no merit. So my point is, listen to your client, even though they may not understand the vernacular of legal work, but they have a keen understanding of the injustice that they may have suffered. And as an attorney, if you have the resources to do so, get somebody that's been impacted by the system to help you talk to and interview your clients. A paralegal, maybe, a lot of people come out of prison actually do paralegal work, and they can help you have that conversation to bridge that communication gap that often exists between defendants and attorneys. So do we have any other questions from our audience? Shad, you got something you want to add?
Yeah, I would like to add a supplement to Amy's question, because it's a very compelling question, and I think one that's incredibly valuable. Marcus Garvey said, if you'd like to reach the people, speak to them in a language that they will understand. I said that to say, when a trial attorney is addressing statutes and subsections of law, working collaboratively with a directly impacted individual, they may not understand and have brilliant, absolutely brilliant ideas that are being stifled based on communication missteps. And those simple missteps, while unintended, can absolutely diminish the valuable communication of reciprocity in defense and in understanding the circumstances. In addition to the financial burden of putting forth a legitimate pre-trial, pre-sentence report such that, like Vivian said, the individual is truly reflected to the court so that every stakeholder in the process of determining an individual outcome has relevant information. Mm-hmm. It really translates into a very human component. Let's consider when you are being interviewed just for a job, do you have elevated anxiety levels? Do you have elevated adrenaline levels? Do you think at the same rapid speed that you would otherwise in less pressured circumstances? One could argue that you probably do not, and that you probably indeed experience elevated levels. Imagine being escorted into a holding cell that may be only the size of 2 chairs and a desk, and quite literally shackled and handcuffed while undergoing an interview to determine whether or not you should be sentenced to X number of years, or an enhancement should be added to your sentence, or some level of mitigation or mitigating circumstances can be added. Do you think that in that moment your anxiety levels are such that you may not be able to communicate effectively and efficiently all of what's happening inside you and all of the resources that you would like to direct this investigator towards? Forensic investigation is a fantastic asset if used correctly, and communication is a wonderful means if used correctly. The missteps, however, can diminish those effective strategies.
Thank you, Sty. Amy, thank you for that wonderful question. You gave us a lot to think about. Either of the panelists have any follow-up thoughts on this question before we pivot to closing?
You know, I come from a family where it was my parents' desire, actually, from the time I was under 12 years old, for me to go into law. They said I had the mouth for it. So I must have talked back a lot. I always had an argument for everything. And I never went into law because I didn't understand the breadth of the occupation. That there's so many things you can do within the realm of the law, that you didn't necessarily have to be a criminal defense attorney or a prosecutor. That there's public interest law, that you could work on public policy, that you could help communities understand, their lease or what was going on in their neighborhoods that was impacting the environment. You could be a Norma Ray and save a community from getting cancer because no one was paying attention to the water. I think that one of the things I'd love to see more lawyers do is to go into schools in underserved communities where they don't understand the breadths of occupations that lawyers can do, and do more of that type of education and lead more of our people into the field of, using the skills of knowing the rules and the statutes of our society, because that also, it doesn't just help us obey those rules. It helps us hold society accountable to the rules that they impose on us. So I would like to see more attorneys do that.
That is a wonderful thought. I mean, yeah, because I was sitting there chuckling. Our first experience or first exposure to the law and the system is, through an arrest or, some infraction instead of, through a holistic education lens. So thanks for sharing that, Vivian. And in closing, each one of my panelists, would you guys take a minute or so to impart a closing thought to the audience? You would like one takeaway you'd like the audience to have as we close this out? Vivian?
I thank you for listening, all of the audience. I thank my panelists for the many things I learned from each of you tonight, and for being so willing to be vulnerable. I've been in this space for 20 years, and I know it is not easy to come and sit on a panel and be public about your life and to share your experience, because we're blessed enough to have overcome a lot of obstacles, and we could probably navigate society and never look back, right? Never look back about who's inside, never look back to see who else is being impacted by their record, because we've accomplished certain things. The fact that you all are doing that makes me feel honored to be on this panel with you. The same for you, Ronald. You're just a rock star. I don't know anybody who doesn't know you, and your story is amazing and powerful. And I want the audience to take away from this panel that we want to be a resource to the field and not an adversary to the field, because we want all people to have access to equal treatment under the law, but we also want that equal treatment to be fair and just treatment, which means we want to get rid of the laws that aren't fair and just. So partner with us. We're here for you, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Vivian. Thank you so very much. Saad, you have a parting thought?
I do, and after that amazing insight and that wonderfully complimentary dialogue from Vivian, I am as honored to have shared this space with every single one of us today, and welcome that. I think my takeaway in this space that I would like for the audience to hold on to is that how we measure success. We often measure success from the trial and or defense attorney space by cases that are won or cases that are lost. Every opportunity, every event, every takeaway, every single case has an opportunity for not only success to take place, but for substantial actual growth to take place. And that I'll illustrate in what my public defender told me when I was 16 years old. He said, Saad, you have the IQ and propensity to be anything you want in this world. I'll see you when you come home. And I was going in to serve a sentence. That seed that he planted would fructify 16 years later in solitary confinement. Don't just strive to being successful. Strive in every interaction to being substantial. Because that substantive dialogue, that truly putting your heart into every single person, human, family that you're working with, interacting with, could be the moment that change is planted in that person's life. And I'll close with what Mahatma Gandhi has said to us all. Be the change that you wish to see in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Saad. Guy, you have less than a minute left. So,
well, I'll just say, you know what, redemption, redemption is not something that the state can either give or can take away. It can only help facilitate it or bring it about, or it can obstruct it. And I think it's up to us to determine what we want the state and what we want the law to do when it comes to addressing crime and harm.
Absolutely. And first, I'd like to give thanks and honors to my esteemed panel, and to the audience. My closing thought would be the slogan that we use at Just Leadership. Those closest to the problem are closest to the solutions. And we hope that you will reach out to those most impacted by the laws and confirm with them around the work that you do. Thank you for joining and listening, and I wish you all well. Have a great weekend, and happy Thanksgiving.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.